영어 동화 세상 리틀팍스
Odyssey Part 1 The Long Journey Home. Our story begins a long time ago when there were many gods and goddesses, and when there were many great warriors and mighty heroes. At this time, many epic battles and great wars were fought because the fortune and pride of both gods and men were bound together. Like the men that the gods and goddesses ruled, these gods and goddesses were imperfect and motivated by petty jealousies and fears. The gods and goddesses, however, rarely fought each other directly because they were immortals. They couldn't harm each other. Instead, they fought their battles and wars through men. Many warriors left to fight in these wars, but only a few returned. Thus, the warrior's greatest dream was to return home alive and victorious. This was Odysseus's dream as well. Odysseus' dream came true. His resourcefulness and cunning were the foundation of his success, but most importantly, it was the favor of Athena that truly made him seem like a god among men. He is perhaps best remembered as the creator of the Trojan horse. The plan came to him in a dream inspired by Athena. Athena was the goddess of wisdom, and sure enough, the plan proved to be brilliant. The wooden horse allowed the Greeks to trick the Trojans because it looked like a gift when it was in fact a secret weapon. Inside the horse, many Greek warriors hid and waited. After the Trojans pulled the horse into their city, the Greek warriors waited until nightfall, and then they quietly crept out of the horse. Once they were within the mighty walls of Troy, they easily defeated the Trojans. After the Greeks had sacked and burned the great city of Troy, they took from its storehouses great quantities of gold, silver, and priceless gems. On the shore near the still smoldering city, the Greeks erected two great pyres, one for the dead and the other for the gods. Before the Greeks left for home, they first honored their dead, and then they sacrificed 100 rams and 100 bulls to the gods to thank them for their triumph. The generous sacrifice pleased the gods, and the next morning the gods sent the Greeks a fair easterly wind, a wind that would take them home. The Greeks rejoiced at this easterly wind, for the gods had given them a priceless gift. Soon 1,000 Greek ships filled with the surviving heroes of the Trojan War set sail. Odysseus, like the others, was happy to be going home because the Trojan War had lasted for 10 long years. With thoughts of his wife and son clearly in his mind, he shouted to his men, "The journey home from triumphant heroes ought to be pleasant, short, and sweet." His men cheered and put their backs into their oars, but none of them were aware that instead, their story would be one of sorrow, suffering, and despair. For Odysseus's fate was also their fate. Their journey was going to be long, and they were going to suffer much, because some of the gods disfavored Odysseus, especially the mighty god of the sea, Poseidon. For several days Odysseus and his companions sailed smoothly on calm seas. The men were sure that the gods favored them, and that they could do no wrong. Consequently, when they came within sight of a city that belonged to their enemy, the Ciconians, Odysseus's men begged him to attack. "The gods favor us, Captain," said the men. "They have given us a fair wind. They have brought us to these uncivilized shores, and it would be a dishonor to the gods not to sack this land." Odysseus listened to his men, and he let them persuade him that the gods had brought them here so that they could add more gold and silver to the treasure that was already stored in their holds. They attacked the city, and they easily defeated the Ciconians. That night, after they had plundered the city, Odysseus urged his men to return to their ships, but the men refused. They wanted to celebrate their victory, so they drank a great deal of wine and feasted on a great number of sheep and oxen without thanking the gods for their victory. The greed and disrespect of Odysseus's men did not please the gods, and the gods sent Hermes, their messenger, to warn the other Ciconian tribes about the attack. The following morning, out of the mist, came a great army of men. Hermes had traveled faster than an arrow from one city to the next, and he had warned all the neighboring Ciconian tribes. Ares, the god of war, inspired these men to fight better. Their ability surprised Odysseus and his men, so that when they attacked, they easily drove Odysseus and his men back to their ships. Once aboard their ships, Odysseus and his men immediately set sail, but the angry gods sent an unforgiving wind to blow them into unknown waters. There was also sorrow in their hearts because they had lost 6 men from each of the 12 ships during the battle. The wind blew like a hurricane, and the earth and sky were hidden from view for 9 straight days. On the 10th day, the skies miraculously cleared. On the horizon they spotted an island, and everyone rejoiced because their food and water were running low. On the island, Odysseus and his men ate a simple lunch of bread and cheese. Odysseus then picked 2 men and said, "Go and find water, and if there are any inhabitants on this fair island, see if we can buy supplies." The 2 men nodded, and they set off at once. As evening approached, the men still had not returned. "I will go and find our friends," said Odysseus. "While I am gone, prepare the ships to sail. We may have to flee this island." Odysseus had not gone far when he met an old man who smiled peacefully at him. "Kind sir," began Odysseus, "have you seen two strangers traveling this road?" "No," replied the old man. "But why worry about them? They will come to no harm here in the land of the lotus eaters. Would you like to eat this flower? It will protect and keep you healthy." Odysseus was about to eat the flowers out of respect for the old man when suddenly an owl screeched in alarm. "Athena is warning me," thought Odysseus to himself. "These flowers are not what they seem." Not long after this, Odysseus found his men, and they were happily eating the lotus flowers. "Let's go," said Odysseus to his men.
Go where?
They answered together. "Home," said Odysseus enthusiastically.
This is our home,
they answered happily. Odysseus told his men to gather some lotus flowers and to follow him back to the ship. "Let us eat these flowers together," said Odysseus kindly. They happily followed him. When they got back to the ships, Odysseus ordered the two men tied to their benches and the flowers destroyed. Odysseus and his men set sail immediately, and as they departed, the two men began to howl and groan in anguish. But Odysseus and his men ignored them because they knew that the flowers had been bewitched. Odyssey Part 2, The Island of the Cyclops. After leaving the island of the Lotus Eaters, Odysseus and his men sailed on for another day. Their hunger and thirst were overwhelming, but they endured. Early the next evening, as the sun settled into the sea, they came to an island that had wild grapes, barley, and goats in abundance. They caught the goats easily, for they had no fear of men. In the distance, another island could be seen near the horizon. Odysseus and his men saw the smoke of many cooking fires rising from this island. "Tomorrow," called Odysseus to his men, "I will cross the sea and seek out those inhabitants. If they are a civilized people, then perhaps we can trade some of our wine for their cured meats and bread." The following morning, Odysseus' ship crossed the sea and set off for the island near the horizon. Odysseus was worried because he did not know if the creatures were civilized or savage, and if they would respect the law. Therefore, when they arrived at the island, he did not dare take all his men onto it. He only chose 12 of his best to accompany him. The rest stayed with the ship. Odysseus and his men took many skins of wine with them, and followed a path from the beach. It led to a cave that was located in the cliffs. The cave was unoccupied because the owner was out tending his flocks. Inside, Odysseus and his men discovered many blocks of cheese, and 2 pens overflowing with lambs and kids. Odysseus' men tried to convince Odysseus to steal the cheese, lambs, and kids, but Odysseus refused. "We have come as friends, not as thieves. We will give the wine as a gift to our host, and we will accept whatever hospitality they will give us in return." The men were not pleased to hear this, but they obeyed. Odysseus and his men passed the time by lighting a fire, making sacrifices to the gods, and eating some of the cheese. Towards evening, a giant human-like creature, with just a single eye in the middle of his forehead, returned with his flocks. It was a Cyclops, and he carried a load of firewood and dropped it near the mouth of the cave. The Cyclops then drove his flocks into the cave. Once the goats and sheep were inside, he rolled a huge rock to block the entrance of the cave. This rock was so big that it would take 20 oxen to move it. Odysseus and his men were a little frightened by the sight and size of the creature, so they silently watched him milk his sheep. But soon the Cyclops' gaze fell upon the strangers. "Who has entered the home of Polyphemus?" Odysseus bowed and replied most humbly, "Kind sir, we are Greeks. We are part of that great expedition that recently won much glory in the conquest of Troy. Now we are returning home. We ask for your hospitality in the name of the gods." Polyphemus did not answer. Instead, he reached out his hand and seized 2 of Odysseus' men. He hurled them against the side of the cave as if they were dolls. The men landed motionless on the floor, and Polyphemus devoured them with great relish. After eating the men, Polyphemus stretched out on the floor to sleep. Odysseus was tempted to plunge his sword into him as he slept. However, he decided that killing Polyphemus would lead them all to certain destruction, because no one except Polyphemus was strong enough to move the rock that blocked the entrance of the cave. The next morning, the Cyclops ate 2 more of Odysseus' men for breakfast. After feasting on the men, the Cyclops moved the rock away from the entrance, drove out his flocks, and carefully put the rock back in its place. While the Cyclops was gone, Odysseus planned to avenge the Cyclops for the murder of his men. First, he asked his remaining 8 men to make a spear from a staff. They sharpened the end of the staff and hid it under the straw on the floor. That evening, after the Cyclops returned home, Odysseus approached him. He handed the Cyclops a bowl of wine, saying, "Before you eat more of my men, drink some wine. You will find that the wine will go well with your meal of human flesh." Polyphemus took the wine and drank some. He had never tasted it before, so he was hugely delighted, and he called for more. Odysseus happily kept refilling his bowl. This pleased the giant so much that he promised Odysseus that he should be the last one devoured.
Since you are the last of the humans to be eaten, I would like to know your name,
inquired Polyphemus. My name, replied Odysseus, is Nobody. Drinking wine on an empty stomach soon made Polyphemus sleepy. As soon as he lay down, he fell asleep. Odysseus took the spear from under the straw and plunged it into the monster's eye. The Cyclops awoke, howling in pain. The howling was so loud that the other Cyclops from the island came to Polyphemus's cave. Outside the cave, they shouted,
What's wrong?
Polyphemus replied,
I am blind. It was nobody that hurt me. Nobody did it.
The Cyclops outside laughed and said,
If nobody has hurt you, then it is your fate to be hurt.
And they went away. The next morning, Polyphemus awoke and still could not see anything from his one eye, but he managed to roll away the huge stone and waited by the entrance with the hope of catching Odysseus. But Odysseus had anticipated this and had ordered his men to tie themselves underneath the largest rams. As Polyphemus led his sheep out of the cave, he checked only their tops, and so Odysseus and his men escaped. When they had gotten a fair distance from the cave, Odysseus and his men untied themselves from the rams and took many sheep down to the shore, to where their ship waited. The men quickly put the sheep on board and set sail. Odysseus shouted,
Cyclops, the gods have punished you for your uncivilized deeds, and it was I, Odysseus, who has left you blind.
Polyphemus howled with rage. He seized a rock and threw it in the direction of the voice. The rock just missed the ship. Odysseus waited until the ship had reached a safer distance, and then he taunted the giant again. As Odysseus and his men sailed away, Polyphemus called out to his father,
Hear me, Poseidon. If I am truly your son, grant me this wish. May Odysseus never reaches home in Ithaca. If, however, the gods decided he was destined to reach his native land, then let him suffer. Let him come home late, with all his comrades dead, in someone else's ship, and let him find troubles in his own house.
Poseidon heard his son, and he saw Odysseus' disdain for the Cyclops. A great rage filled Poseidon, and he called to his son,
O my son, Odysseus' destiny is indeed fixed in the stars. His fate is to return home, but the stars, like the gods, are immortal. He will come home late. His comrades will all have died. He will arrive in another person's ship, and he will have trouble in his house. My son, I swear, Odysseus will suffer.
Odyssey Part 3. The Curse Comes True. Odysseus and his men left the island of the Cyclops, not realizing that Polyphemus had asked his father Poseidon to curse them. Unlike mortal men, the gods can be quite patient in their revenge, so Poseidon allowed Odysseus and his men to sail where the wind took them. After several days of sailing, they came to a strange island that seemed to be floating on the sea. Like a large vessel, the island was inhabited because there was a large villa with a windswept pavilion. The craftsmanship of the villa and the pavilion were incredible. This place is too strange and too beautiful to be the work of mortal men, said Odysseus to his crew. Let us go there cautiously, because we do not want to make the gods or people who live there angry. His crew agreed, and they drew lots to see who among them would accompany Odysseus. From his own portion of the treasure, Odysseus chose a gift to bring their host. It was a brooch made of gold, silver, and jewels in the shape of a butterfly. In beauty there is nothing finer than this brooch, said Odysseus to his men. I chose this as a gift for my wife, but a beautiful present is worthless so far from home. I hope its beauty will inspire the god or goddess who will be our host to hasten our journey. The men nodded and appreciated the sacrifice that their leader was making for all of them. Cleanliness is next to godliness, so Odysseus and the men chosen to go with him bathed in the ocean before leaving the ship. The villa and pavilion were located on a steep mountain that overlooked the beach. They could tell that the trail up to the villa was seldom traveled because it was overgrown with grass and weeds. As Odysseus and his men approached the top of the mountain, they thought they could hear someone or something whistling. But when they entered the pavilion, there was no one, only the four winds chasing themselves among the columns of the pavilion. From the villa, Odysseus and his men heard what sounded like a party. There was shouting, singing, and much laughter. I think our host is throwing quite a party, said Odysseus to his men. If fate has not doomed us to die here upon this windswept rock, I think we shall enjoy ourselves. Odysseus and his men eagerly went to the door of the villa. But before Odysseus could knock, the four winds came rushing past and blew the door wide open.
Quiet,
shouted a tall man with windswept silver hair.
The winds are my pets, and they have brought me news of visitors. Let us see who has come to the island of the winds."
Odysseus bowed low, and his men did likewise. "Great and noble immortal, I am Odysseus. I have brought you a token of our goodwill." From beneath his cloak he took out the wondrous jewel-encrusted butterfly and gave it to the god. "My men and I are returning from our victorious triumph at Troy."
"Well met, Odysseus. I am Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, and they are my children. This is indeed a brooch of the finest craftsmanship. It is, I think, too fine to be worn. I will set it free."
Aeolus blew on the butterfly, and it spread its wings and fluttered around the room.
"Thank you for your gift, and please do not think me rude, but I would like to make a request of you. I grow weary of the conversation and songs of my children. If you tell me the story of your triumph, I will give the wayward voyager a most precious gift."
Odysseus and his men gladly retold their tale of battles won and battles lost. Aeolus and his children were greatly entertained, and Aeolus took Odysseus aside and gave him a large leather-bound sack, saying,
"Tie this sack to the mast of your ship, for I have captured all the winds except for the west one, which will take you home. The west wind will chase her friends and take your ship home. Do not open the sack until you are home, or the other winds will drive you away in anger."
Odysseus thanked Aeolus and did as he said. He was so happy to be finally on his way home that he stood at the wheel of his ship for 4 days and 4 nights. On the morning of the 5th day, he and his men came within sight of Ithaca and home. Exhausted, Odysseus fell asleep where he stood. While Odysseus had been sailing, Poseidon had been whispering to the crew.
"Odysseus isn't going to share the treasure that Aeolus gave to him. Open the bag and divide it fairly among yourselves."
While Odysseus was awake, no man dared to open the bag, but once Odysseus was asleep, the men in all the ships stared greedily at the large sack tied to the mast of Odysseus' ship. One of the men climbed up the mast and unfastened the sack's leather strap. The roar was deafening. The 3 imprisoned winds rushed out of the sack, and Poseidon filled their anger with lies. Soon the winds were chasing Odysseus and his ships across the sea and straight back to Aeolus Island. After Aeolus heard the wind's tale, he knew that Odysseus had angered Poseidon, and he refused to help Odysseus a second time. Odysseus and his men left the floating island, dreading Poseidon's anger and the fate that awaited them. The angry winds continued to plague Odysseus and his men. The winds drove them to an island inhabited by giants. Odysseus and his men made for the safety of a harbor between 2 steep cliffs. Once they were safely within the harbor, the winds left them alone. But it was a trap. Poseidon had warned the giants of Odysseus' approach. From the cliffs, the giants hurled massive boulders of granite at Odysseus and his ships. Soon the boulders were falling like rain, smashing and sinking his ships. Odysseus ordered his men to flee, but there were too many boulders falling, and Odysseus watched as each of his ships sank, and his men died. Odysseus' ship, however, was curiously protected. Athena had extended the corner of her great shield to protect Odysseus from the death that was happening all around him. He and his men escaped, but they cried bitterly for the friends they had lost. They left the land of the giants and sailed knowing that fate had spared them, but not knowing for how long.